In Vancouver, in 1978, a psychologist built a paradise for rats. 200 square feet of space, painted walls, cedar shavings on the floor, tin cans to hide inside, raised platforms, nesting boxes, running wheels. 16 rats living together, males and females, exactly as they would in the wild. And in the corner, 2 water bottles, one filled with plain water, one filled with water laced with morphine. The rats could drink from either one, whenever they wanted, as much as they wanted. Almost none of them chose the drugs. That result should have changed everything. It didn't. For 20 years before this experiment, science had been running a different one. A single rat, a small metal box, completely alone, 2 levers, food, or morphine. The rat chose morphine. Every time, researchers watched rats press the drug lever until they stopped eating, until they stopped sleeping, until they were dead. The experiment was replicated in hundreds of laboratories across the world. The conclusion seemed permanent. Put the chemical in the brain and the brain cannot say no. This is your brain on drugs. This is why addiction exists. This is why you cannot simply stop. 1 rat, 1 cage, 1 lever. That is what built 60 years of global drug policy. The man who built the paradise was named Bruce Alexander. He was a professor of psychology at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and he had a question that nobody else was asking. The rat in the box was alone. It had nothing to explore, nothing to do, nobody to be with. Of course it took the drugs. What else was it going to do? Alexander pointed out something that should have been obvious from the beginning. The original experiments had not tested addiction. They had tested what a completely isolated animal does when it has nothing else. They had tested despair and called it chemistry, so he changed the experiment. He called it Rat Park. He gave the rats everything their nature required: space, community, play, connection, a life. And then he offered the same morphine water the caged rats had chosen over everything else. The Rat Park rats barely touched it. In some tests, they consumed 19 times less morphine than the isolated rats. 19, same drug, same access, same species, different world. Almost no addiction. He went further. He took rats that were already addicted, animals that had been sitting alone in cages choosing morphine for weeks, physically dependent. Already hooked by the chemical, he moved them into Rat Park. He expected them to keep choosing the drug. They didn't. Most of them reduced their consumption voluntarily. Not completely. The isolation had left a mark that didn't fully erase, but they chose less. Given a life worth living, they chose to live it. The drug had not permanently taken them. The emptiness had. Alexander submitted his findings to scientific journals. Nature rejected it without explanation. Psychopharmacology sat on it for 2 years before publishing it in a back issue. The research that disproved the chemical theory of addiction was reviewed, noted, and quietly set aside. The labs that had built the caged rat model did not repeat his experiment. They continued publishing caged rat studies. The field moved on, and governments kept spending. The real proof had already happened without anyone in a laboratory. During the Vietnam War, around 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam were using heroin, not occasionally, regularly. The United States government prepared for a catastrophe. Clinics were built. Treatment programs were funded. Officials expected hundreds of thousands of returning addicts. A researcher named Lee Robbins at Washington University tracked what actually happened. 95% of the soldiers who had been using heroin in Vietnam simply stopped when they came home. Not with treatment, not with programs, not gradually over months. They went home to their families, their jobs, their neighborhoods, their rat park, and they stopped. The drug had not permanently rewired their brains. The environment had. Vietnam was the cage. Home was the park. That study was published in 1974, 4 years before Bruce Alexander built his experiment. The evidence existed twice, in 2 completely different forms, and the conclusion was the same both times. It was ignored both times. In 1971, Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. Since then, the United States alone has spent over $1 trillion fighting the chemical. Every campaign, every slogan, every prison sentence. Just say no. This is your brain on drugs, built entirely on the caged rat model, built on what a desperate, isolated animal does when it has nothing. Alexander's findings were available. Robbins' findings were available. They showed that environment mattered more than chemistry. They showed that connection was more powerful than craving. They were ignored because they were inconvenient. If addiction is about the cage and not the chemical, then solving it means changing the conditions of people's lives. That is harder than a slogan. That does not fit on a poster. That does not sell a campaign. So the cage model survived, and people kept dying inside it. In 2015, a journalist named Johan Hari spent 3 years visiting every country on Earth where addiction was being handled differently. Countries that had decriminalized drugs and spent the money on housing, jobs, and connection instead. His conclusion was one sentence: the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. The rats already knew this. The Vietnam veterans already knew this. Alexander had proven this in 1978. It took the world until 2015 to start saying it out loud. Look at what has been happening in the meantime. Loneliness rates in the developed world have doubled since the 1980s. People are spending more time alone than at any point in recorded human history. Social media replaced physical presence. Remote work replaced shared space. Streaming replaced communal experience. Deaths of despair from drugs, alcohol, and suicide have been climbing every year since the 1990s. The cage got bigger. The walls just became invisible. If you have ever struggled with something you could not stop, if you have ever chosen something that hurt you again and again, even knowing what it cost, the experiment already had your answer. It was not a flaw in your character. It was not a broken brain. It was not weakness. It was a cage, real or invisible, physical or social, chosen or inherited. A life that was missing something your nervous system has needed for 300,000 years. The rats who were given Rat Park did not need willpower. They did not need discipline. They did not need to say no. They just needed somewhere worth being. You are not the rat who could not stop. You are the rat who was never given the park.